Was John Stuart Mill a socialist or a capitalist?
In applying the principles of utility to government and social institutions, Mill recognized the productive consequences of free markets. But he thought that public ownership of production might benefit a greater number by eliminating the extremes of poverty. He believed in democratic government, provided that citizens were well informed and it was not a simple majority rule based on emotions.
What characterizes 19th-century philosophy as a foundation for current philosophical thought?
Philosophy became fully modern in the 19th century in the sense that 19th century philosophical schools of thought and methods of analysis are still practiced by professional philosophers today. Modern philosophy is characterized by empiricism on the one side and a reaction against empiricism on the other. It consists of a series of inquiries that continue to be used as classic foundations for contemporary thinkers, who build upon it still. Its primary founders flourished in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and they set the stage with problems that gave rise to existentialism and phenomenology, or continental philosophy, American philosophy, or pragmatism, Anglo-American analytic philosophy, including what is now known as philosophy of science, and the new philosophies of post-structuralism, postmodernism, feminism, and race and post-colonialism. The hallmark of modern philosophy has been a constantly renewed awareness of other fields as philosophically interesting, such as social criticism, political science, physical science, psychology, mathematics, logic, and literature, and new understandings of the human subject as both a generator and subject matter of philosophical thought.
What happened that affected empiricism in the 19th century?
Empiricism became systematized as an overall philosophical methodology with applications for science, ethics, and political science. This was largely the work of two men who did not agree with each other. William Whewell, 1794–1866, and John Stuart Mill, 1806–1873, and a third, Auguste Comte, 1798–1857, who founded the new school of thought called positivism. Comte was also important in founding sociology, but can be considered here as an empiricist for his methodology. Whewell was primarily focused on science and its popularization. Mill was able to bring a coherent explanation of empirical science into philosophy because his empiricism was more easily accepted by empiricist philosophers than was Whewell's. Mill also extended empiricism to ethics, political philosophy, and rights for women. Comte was the most extreme empiricist to date. and in the 20th century positivism was revisited as a method for doing philosophy in general.
Why did John Stuart Mill distrust majority rule?
Mill argued in On Liberty, 1859, that the whole of society could be swayed by the mere opinions and passions of a majority. For this reason, free speech was essential. Even if those who seek to suppress free speech are correct, if they are not willing to present their arguments afresh, they might come to hold their correct conclusions as mere superstitions. Mill thus believed in freedom of opinion for its utility in promoting a generally rational pubic epistemology or shared theory of what constitutes knowledge. He thought it was important that people have standards based on what is known as opposed to mere opinion. If there is free speech and public disagreement, then the parties that prevail have to give reasons for their views, according to Mill. In other words, Mill thought that free speech would encourage good arguments, and that good arguments would result in an informed public. Knowledge, according to Mill, required both reasoning and a justification of beliefs.
Was Immanuel Kant only interested in the foundations for knowledge of the physical world?
No. In addition to what Kant held to be man's universal awe for the starry heavens above, he addressed the moral law within as a subject of practical reason. He also had lasting things to say about the self and belief in God.
Is there interest in the Marquis de Sade today?
Yes. The Marquis de Sade has endured as a glamorous and enigmatic film subject. The 1969 film De Sade was shot in Germany, and speculation about who its director really was continues to the present time. In 1996, The Marquis was revisited in Dark Prince, which was not a blockbuster. The most recent reprise is the 2000 movie Quills, starring Geoffrey Rush as the Marquis, Kate Winslet as Madeline, a teenager with whom de Sade has an affair, Joaquin Phoenix as the Abbé du Calmeyer, and Michael Caine as Dr. Royer Collard. The setting of Quills is an insane asylum in Napoleonic France, where the Marquis has been confined because of his licentious, depraved ideas that he graphically expresses in writing. Even while incarcerated, he has been getting his manuscripts out to be published. Napoleon himself is disturbed by this travesty and sends Dr. Royer Collard, a mental health specialist, to deal with the Marquis and cure him. Dr. Royer Collard is a hypocrite who abuses his young wife. The film turns on the conflict between the Abbé and de Sade. The Abbé slowly goes mad, and the Marquis experiences remorse for the effect of his ideas on another. Overall, Quills is an aesthetically sophisticated film that dramatizes the continuously mordant wit of the Marquis de Sade, which coexisted with what would otherwise be unadorned pornography. In defying the optimism of the Age of Reason, he used its reigning weapon.
What was John Stuart Mill's formulation of utilitarianism?
Mill showed how the principle of utility can be used to account for individual action and collective values. As a consequence of individuals seeking their own happiness, the good of society as a personal goal might be a result. Social values such as justice, in Mill's account, do not benefit society as mere abstractions, but only if individuals seek them out in their own lives.
Who was William Whewell?
William Whewell, 1794–1866, was a polymath who contributed work to mechanics, mineralogy, geology, astronomy, political economy, theology, education, law, architecture, ethics, the philosophy of science, and what he named ideology. He was a founder and president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, and a Fellow of the Royal Society. Whewell invented the term scientist analogously with artist. He was the most influential figure in British education in the 19th century.
Kant's motivating metaphysical question was: how is it possible to know certain principles about the world, without prior experience?
Kant's solution was to apply a transcendental deduction to such principles and show that without them experience would not be possible. For example, concerning causation, he argued that consciousness itself requires orderly experience based on necessary connections in reality. This was Kant's answer to David Hume's, 1711–1776, reduction of causation to constant conjunction. He rejected Hume's skepticism that constant conjunction is all that there is by claiming that the world could only make sense to us if we assumed that there were real causal connections in it. In his Prolegomena to Every Future Metaphysics, 1783, Kant famously said that Hume had awakened him from his dogmatic slumbers.
What was William Whewell's fundamental antithesis of knowledge?
Whewell claimed that in every act of knowledge, there are two opposite elements, which we may call ideas and perceptions. Whewell was influenced by Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, and shared Kant's belief that scientific information is not a pure collection of objective facts in the world, but that a prior system of ideas is required to arrive at scientific knowledge. However, he did not go as far as Kant in locating the possibility for scientific knowledge wholly within the mind. That is, unlike Kant, Whewell thought that the world as it is known to human beings exists independently of human minds. Neither did Whewell go as far as the empiricists, who emphasized induction and observation, in what he called the sensationalistic school.
What were the main facts about Whewell's life?
William Whewell was born in Lancaster in 1794. His father was a master carpenter, and his mother wrote poetry. He studied at Heversham Grammar School and attended Trinity College, Cambridge, on a scholarship. He was elected to the Royal Society in 1820, when he was just 26. After being ordained as an Anglican priest, a requirement for the post, he was chair of mineralogy at Trinity College. From 1828 to 1832. He became professor of moral philosophy in 1838. Whewell married Cordelia Marshall and became master of Trinity College and vice-chancellor of Cambridge in 2 separate terms. When Cordelia died, he married Lady Affleck, who was the sister of a friend. Lady Affleck died, and then Whewell himself passed away after he was injured in a riding accident. His work was largely neglected until the mid-20th century. The revival of interest in his empirical and theoretical achievements has been substantial ever since.
What was Immanuel Kant's notion of synthetic a priori knowledge?
Knowledge is synthetic or ampliative, according to Kant. If it is about objects that can be experienced in the world, it is a priori if it can be known without experience.
What was Auguste Comte's positivism?
Comte advocated the use of mathematics for making decisions in ways that still influence statistics and business models today. He believed that our knowledge all comes from observation and asserted that it was impossible to know anything about physical objects that could not be observed. The goal of science was prediction, said Comte, and explanation has the same structure as prediction. He meant by this that a theory that generates predictions about what will happen can also explain what has happened. For example, suppose our theory is that friction, oxygen, and combustible material will cause fire. From this we can predict that striking a match will result in a flame. And we can also explain why striking the match causes the flame. Comte also thought that imagination should always be kept in check by observation.
What was Immanuel Kant's moral system?
Kant's moral starting point is the distinction between things that are instrumentally or hypothetically good because they have good consequences, and things that are good in and of themselves. The only thing that is good in itself is a goodwill or benevolence, without which every other gift of fortune can be just cause for resentment. Morality is for rational beings, and rational beings require principles of action. In the community of rational beings, or the kingdom of ends, actions are good if they are autonomous, which is to say freely chosen. According to Kant, a rational being is autonomous or self-ruling. The rules that a rational being uses to regulate himself are absolute, what Kant called categorical. Such rules are imperatives and are followed for their own sake. Hypothetical rules, by contrast, are followed in order to make something else happen. For example, do not harm innocent people would be a categorical rule, and eat your vegetables would be a hypothetical rule.
What was Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative?
Kant is usually interpreted to have two formulations. First, act so that the maxim of your action, or the generalization describing it, can be willed by you to be a general rule, to be followed by all rational agents. In other words, only do those things that you as a benevolent, rational being can will that everyone do. The test of a categorical imperative is what happens if everyone follows it. Something that has good consequences in a particular case might not have good consequences in all cases. For example, if the maxim is obey traffic rules, and you come to a red light with no other cars in attendance, you may not drive through it, even though the consequences in this particular case would be benign. Or, to use an example of Kant's, if the maxim is not to lie, and a madman is looking for a friend of yours whose whereabouts you know, you may not lie in this case. Because overall you can't benevolently will that everyone be permitted to lie whenever the consequences are good for them. To take another example of Kant's, you may not take your own life. No matter how miserable you are, because you categorically can't will suicide as a good action.
What was Immanuel Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative?
According to Kant, all rational beings are intrinsically valuable. And in the kingdom of ends, no one is a means to the end of anyone else. In the world of affairs, what we do and who we are have prices. But in the kingdom of ends there are no prices, only dignities. The second formulation of the categorical imperative is that one must always act to treat humanity either as another person or oneself, as an end and never as a means. In other words, don't use people.
What was Immanuel Kant's theory of the self?
Kant distinguished between the empirical ego and the transcendental ego. The empirical ego is what we normally think of as the self and are able to experience. The transcendental ego is the necessary origin of those fundamental structures of thought and intuition that are necessary for experience. The transcendental ego is known only as an object of thought, and not as an object of direct experience.
What are some details of the Marquis de Sada's life?
De Sada was born in the palace of Condat. His father was a count, his mother a lady-in-waiting to the princess. He attended a Jesuit college and was captain of a cavalry regiment in the 7 Years' War. After which he married the elder sister of the woman he loved, fathering 2 sons and 1 daughter. In 1766 he had a theatre constructed at his castle in Lacoste, in the 1990s. Fashion designer Pierre Cardin acquired the ruins of de Sada's castle as a site for theatre productions. He was a libertine, said to have sexually abused young people of both sexes, both servants and prostitutes. He was accused of kidnapping and abusing a woman named Rose Keller in 1768, after she escaped. He was also accused of blasphemy, which was a more serious offense at the time than the sexual crimes. When prostitutes in Paris complained of de Sada's abuse, he was exiled to his castle. Then he had an affair with his sister-in-law, for which his mother-in-law secured an arrest warrant from the king. A series of arrests and escapes in which his wife was his accomplice ensued. He was confined to an insane asylum at Charenton after being imprisoned in the Bastille. In the asylum, the abbé allowed him to produce plays. When he was released in 1790, his wife divorced him.
Why are Immanuel Kant's epistemology and metaphysics transcendental?
To this day, philosophers dispute whether Kant was providing a theory of how the mind in fact works or instead a critical theory of how we ought to view knowledge. In either case, Kant's epistemology and metaphysics are both transcendental. His epistemology is transcendental in that he reasons a priori from what is known to what must be the case in order to account for what is known. And his metaphysics is transcendental in that what ultimately exists exceeds and eludes both our direct knowledge and full understanding. Even though we are justified in postulating it according to certain principles of reason.
What is known about Immanuel Kant's life?
Immanuel Kant was born in Königsberg in East Prussia. His father was a saddler, and his grandfather was a Scottish immigrant. After attending the local high school, He was taught by the philosopher Marin Knudsen at the University of Königsberg. He worked as a tutor and returned to take a master's degree, after which he was employed as a Privatdozent. Private docent, or PD, to teach physics, mathematics, anthropology, geography, and some philosophy. In his courses on anthropology and geology, he taught the prevailing view of European racial supremacy over Asians and Africans. He was poor until 1770, when he secured the position of Chair of Logic and Metaphysics at Königsberg. Other European intellectuals, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, whom Kant greatly admired, constantly moved and traveled to secure their fame and livings, with amorous and political adventure. As a kind of byproduct of their intellectual careers. But that was not for Kant. He never left the area of East Prussia, and remained a bachelor in Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, all his life. When the Prussian king asked him not to publish further about religion in 1794, he duly complied. Kant's health was fragile, but he took care of himself, living until he was 80. He relied on travelers and published works for information about the outside world and was content to dine with friends and fulfill his professorial duties, including a term as rector of the university. Kant's early works were about natural science, the most notable being his General History of Nature and Theory of the Heavens, 1755. His magnum opus was the Critique of Pure Reason. But when it finally appeared in 1781, few could understand it. He tried to make his ideas more accessible in his Prolegomena to Every Future Metaphysics, 1783. This was followed by his 1790 Critique of Practical Reason and the Critique of Judgment. In 1793 and 1797, he published Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason and the Metaphysic of Morals. Kant was by then famous, but younger thinkers undertook to explain his system better than he had. He was working on his response to them in his opus posthumum when he died.
How important was Joseph Marie de Maistre?
In his Freedom and Its Betrayal, philosopher and historian Isaiah Berlin. 1909 to 1997, listed de Maistre as a major opponent to liberty in the Enlightenment. In the 19th century, French literary critic Émile Faguet, 1847 to 1916, described de Maistre as a fierce absolutist, a furious theocrat, an intransigent legitimist, apostle of a monstrous trinity composed of Pope, King and Hangman, always and everywhere the champion of the hardest, narrowest, and most inflexible dogmatism. A dark figure out of the Middle Ages, part learned doctor, part inquisitor, part executioner.
Who was Auguste Comte?
Isidore Marie Auguste François Xavier Comte. 1798 to 1857, was famous and influential in his day as a sociologist, and even coined the word sociology. He was the first Western sociologist. Comte has also endured as the founder of positivism. Comte taught mathematics for a while at l'École Polytechnique in Paris, where he himself was educated. Although mental illness to the extent of psychotic episodes that required hospitalization interfered with his work, his condition stabilized enough for him to complete his major work during a marriage that ended in divorce. After the woman he loved in a subsequent platonic relationship died, he formulated his mission to create a new religion of humanity. Comte published Cours de philosophie positive, Course in Positive Philosophy, in 6 volumes from 1830 to 1832.
Did John Stuart Mill have much chance to indulge in the pleasure principle as he grew up?
The pleasure principle was certainly not applied to Mill's young life in the same sense as Jeremy Bentham's. 1748 to 1832, formulation, although it possibly was in Mill's more nuanced version of utilitarianism, which distinguished between higher and lower pleasures. Mill's father, James, with help from his friend Bentham, educated the young Mill at home. Young John knew Greek at 3, Latin at 5, logic by 12, and economics by 16. He was also deeply schooled in a social mission to increase the good for the greatest number through progressive political programs. Mill had a nervous breakdown at 20. Biographers believe that his highly structured and rigorous childhood education was the cause of an emotional imbalance. The humanities had been neglected in his education, and his social interactions with peers were limited by the demands of his studies. Mill then began a course of study in literature to develop his more humanistic sensibilities. He read Romantic poetry and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and he began to rethink Bentham's simple hedonic calculus. The result was Mill's famous distinction between higher and lower pleasures and a scathing assessment of Bentham's character as oblivious and uncultured. Bentham, an essay first published in the London and Westminster Review in 1838, and revised in 1859 for his own Dissertations and Discussion, Volume 1.
Was Immanuel Kant a recluse?
Yes. He lived a very precise and orderly life, and his neighbors claimed to be able to set their clocks by his daily walks. During the 1770s, he retreated into what biographers call his silent decade. He set himself the task of figuring out how perception and intellect are connected. Never a bon vivant, he withdrew from even minimal social contact. But he was very forthright about what was going on in his life and did not make the usual social excuses. When a former student tried to coax him out, he responded in this manner: Any change makes me apprehensive, even if it offers the greatest promise of improving my condition. And I am persuaded by this natural instinct of mine that I must take heed if I wish that the threads which the fates spin so thin and weak in my case to be spun to any length. My great thanks, to my well-wishers and friends, who think so kindly of me as to undertake my welfare. But at the same time a most humble request to protect me in my current condition from any disturbance.
Who was Harriet Taylor?
Harriet Taylor, 1807 to 1858, was John Stuart Mill's wife. He met her when he was 25, while still recovering from his nervous breakdown. She had been married since the age of 18 to John Taylor, with whom she had 3 sons. Mill and Harriet Taylor had what they described as a platonic relationship, until the death of her husband after 20 years of marriage. At one point, the Taylors separated, with Harriet taking her daughter to live with her, while John raised their sons. Some feminist writers believe that Harriet was actually the author of Mill's The Subjection of Women. 1869, as well as other writings, such as On Liberty, 1859, for which Mill gave her great credit. Taylor's contemporary detractors referred to her as that stupid woman, and said she only appeared to have been Mill's collaborator because she was adept at repeating what he had already said or written. Taylor published very little in her own name. She was a founding member of the Kensington Society, which circulated the first petition for the rights of women. And she contributed articles to the Unitarian Journal, monthly repository. Mill was without question extremely devoted to her, and after her death he wrote, "Were I but capable of interpreting to the world one half the great thoughts and noble feelings which are buried in her grave, I should be the medium of a greater benefit to it than is ever likely to arise from anything that I can write, unprompted and unassisted by her all but unrivaled wisdom."
Is Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative different from the Golden Rule?
Yes, it is. According to the Golden Rule, we should act as we would have others act toward us. If our tastes are perverted or we do not care for our own welfare, the Golden Rule could permit acts of depravity and violence, but such acts could never be willed categorically. Moreover, Kant's system is strongly based on individual good, will toward the community of all other rational individuals. There is a debt to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's, 1712 to 1778, idea of the common good here. Indeed, Kant greatly respected Rousseau's moral philosophy.
How were John Stuart Mill's views on women influential?
Mill expressed these views at a time when it was fashionable for educated men to sentimentalize the traditional role of women. Such sentimentalization, for example, can be seen in social thinker and critic John Ruskin's Sesame and Lilies, or English writer and critic Coventry Patmore's poem The Angel in the House. Many religious authorities and political leaders were outraged and shocked by Mill's opinions on this matter. On the other hand, the suffragist movement had already begun in both England and the United States, and the support of a famous philosopher and public figure was perceived to be a great help in the cause. Nonetheless, it wasn't until about 50 years after the subjection of women, 1869, was published that women got the vote in both countries. Although the rights Mill advocated for women are now largely taken for granted, some feminists believe that Mill's failure to address the issue of the division of labor within the family rendered his arguments for the liberation of women incomplete, as did his basic assumption that, even once liberated, the vast majority of women would still choose to be wives and mothers. And although Mill stressed the personal development of women, he did so more within the context of their traditional roles than in terms of their autonomy as human beings.
What was John Stuart Mill's final assessment of religious belief?
Mill concluded that, given the evils of this world, it is impossible that there is a God who is both all-powerful and loves humankind. He did think, though, that it was likely that there exists a less than omnipotent but nonetheless benevolent deity. Overall, Mill believed that human beings can control their happiness on earth through improvements in education and social institutions. Still, he saw the utility of religion for some who modeled their own morality based on Jesus Christ's teachings.
How was Jonathan Swift opposed to Enlightenment values?
Jonathan Swift, 1667–1745, is considered to have been at heart a sincere Christian who did not believe in the rationality of human nature, but rather thought that whenever order is established, it then begins to disintegrate. In 1709, in a project for the advancement of reason and the reformation of manners, he implored Queen Anne to begin a moral crusade against contemporary vice. However, the great irony about Swift was that his characteristic path to moral reform was through satire and sarcasm. He sent up the established respectability of his age through forays into fiction, as well as the rhetoric of a pamphleteer. Thus, when it became clear that he would not get support for the plight of the poor in Ireland, he and his friends founded the Scriblouse Club for the sake of engaging in activity against the dunces. Swift is most famous for his 1726 satire, Gulliver's Travels. His 1729 A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People from Being a Burthen to Their Parents or Country, and for making them beneficial to the public, was a shocking criticism of the treatment of the Irish poor, in which he suggested that their babies be substituted for the traditional goose that graced the tables of absentee English landlords.
Who was the Marquis de Sade?
Dinatien Alphonse François de Sade, 1740–1814, was a French nobleman and revolutionary best known for his shocking pornographic works Justine, The Misfortunes of Virtue, Juliet, Vice Richly Rewarded, 120 Days of Sodom, The School of Licentiousness, Incest, and the Crimes of Love. In an age that was not strongly focused on vice and sin, he managed to spend over 30 years of his life incarcerated in an insane asylum, as well as in prison, mostly on account of his writing. The term sadism is based on his name.
What was Immanuel Kant's Copernican revolution?
Just as Copernicus changed the center of our universe from Earth to Sun, Kant relocated the basic principles and categories of reality, as studied by science, from the external world to the mind. Like John Locke, 1632–1704, he began with an examination of the powers of the mind, and an aim to reject metaphysical claims that could not be rationally justified. He posited a human rational necessity to understand real experience in space and time, and a practical need to live with other rational beings, seeking the principles that could fulfill those requirements. In 1770 Kant argued in On the Form and Principles of the Sensible and Intelligible World that our knowledge of space and time is only about appearances, but that we are still justified in making limited claims about what lies behind those appearances. This was the foundation for what became known as critical philosophy. Kant's revolutionary claim was that we have a priori knowledge of both space and time, because they are the forms of our perception. Space is the organization of experience in the outer world, while time is the organization of experience in the inner world. This was followed by the two editions of his Critique of Pure Reason, with his Prolegomena to any future metaphysics published in between to respond to criticism.
What was the intellectual merit of de Sade's endeavors?
De Sade was elected to the National Convention in 1790 and wrote political pamphlets calling for a direct vote. Simone de Beauvoir, 1908–1986. And other 20th-century existentialists interpreted a radical doctrine of freedom in his writings. His emphasis on the importance of sexuality in human life is said to have anticipated Sigmund Freud. Others have seen seeds of nihilism in his work. The 20th-century psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan claimed that Desauta's ethics were a counterpart to Immanuel Kant's 1724–1804 categorical imperative. The 20th-century feminist Andrea Dworkin, 1946–2005, analyzed Desauta to illustrate the inherently violent misogynistic nature of all heterosexual pornography.
What are John Stuart Mill's progressive ideas in the subjection of women?
Mill begins the subjection of women, 1869, by saying that it is more difficult to argue against a position that is held on irrational grounds than one based on reasoning. René Descartes 1596–1650 made a similar claim at the beginning of his Meditations. Those who hold irrational views will not be persuaded to change them by rational argument but will just look for a more profound basis of their opinion, even to the point of claiming it is the result of instinct. This set the stage for Mill's claim that the condition of women at the time he wrote was the result of a long historical tradition of might makes right, combined with the power enjoyed by all men simply by being born male. He compared this condition to slavery on a number of counts. Women were completely dependent on men for their livelihood, being deprived of education and means for productive employment. Women did not have control over their own bodies or children in marriage. Women lacked civil rights, such as the right to vote or own property. And women were subject to violence and rape within marriage, without legal recourse. Mill also claimed that women were trained to display the traits of mind and character, or lack thereof, that would make them desirable subordinates to men. Stupidity, preoccupation with appearance, and adoration of and submission to men. Men assumed that all women wanted to be wives and mothers, which made their exclusion of them from education and the professions ironic, to say the least. But although marriage appeared to be a contractual relationship, women did not have any real freedom to withhold their consent because they could not earn a living on their own. Against existing arguments that women were not the equals of men, Mill claimed that insofar as women had been so suppressed by their circumstances in marriage and lack of education, men knew very little about what their true capabilities were. He claimed that the highest masculine and the highest feminine characters were clearly equal.
Did Jonathan Swift go mad?
Some thought he did, based on the scatological and prurient interests that his later writings expressed. For instance, in his 1732 poem The Lady's Dressing Room, after morbidly describing a long list of disgusting physical effluvia from a woman's process of cleaning, grooming, dressing, and applying makeup, he wrote at the end, "Disgusted Strephon stole away / repeating in his amorous fits. / oh. Celia, Celia, Celia shits." At the same time, Swift also wrote another strange poem, A beautiful young nymph going to bed, which is about a woman who repulsively removes all the parts of herself, including prostheses, that made her seem attractive. Swift apparently had an obsession about the falseness of women. Although he was a priest in the Anglican Church, he had a 17-year love affair with Esther van Humrij, a former tutti, whom he rejected for the younger Esther Johnson, known in his writings as Stella. Esther van Humrij, or Vanessa to Swift, was the friend who left money to George Berkeley, 1685 to 1783. She died soon after Swift finally rejected her. Esther Johnson also died young. In 1742, Swift was pronounced of unsound mind and memory, incapable of looking after himself or his affairs. When Swift died in 1745, he left his estate to found an insane asylum. But he was apparently not insane from psychological causes. Rather, he had labyrinthine vertigo, known as Meniere's disease, a physiological ailment that was not well understood in his day. His final words were, "I am a fool." Swift's Latin epitaph reads in English, "When savage indignation can no longer torture the heart. Proceed, traveler, and, if you can, imitate the strenuous avenger of noble liberty."
What were John Stuart Mill's views on marriage?
Mill concluded that human virtue flourishes best in friendships between equals, and that was his ideal for marriage. By a real enrichment of the two natures, each acquiring the tastes and capacities of the other. As a utilitarian, Mill justified this ideal of friendship between equals for marriage by claiming that it would allow half of the human population to make contributions to civilized life, which had not yet been made. He also believed that women had already demonstrated distinctive moral strengths and altruistic impulses, so that their participation in civic life and the professions would advance civilized values in general.
What was John Stuart Mill's view of logic and scientific methodology?
Foremost, Mill argued that deductive logic does not depend on intuition for its proof, but rather on internal consistency. The foundational assumptions or axioms of all sciences are based on experience. Even the shared scientific axiom that nature is uniform or law-like is proved through simple enumeration of confirming examples, that is, through induction. More specific causal explanations do no more than summarize necessary and sufficient conditions. A necessary condition is always present when the effect occurs. The effect is always present when a sufficient condition is present. For example, a bullet to the brain is sufficient to cause death in most cases. But it is not necessary because people die from other causes. Or, oxygen is necessary to cause fire. But it is not sufficient because fire requires friction and combustible material, as well as oxygen. Mill also thought that the basic principles of arithmetic and geometry could be proved by induction. He agreed with Isidore Marie Auguste François Xavier Comte. 1798 to 1857, about a unified view of the social sciences, whereby the laws for more general sciences could be derived from what is known about more specific sciences. For example, observations of individual human behavior could result in a science of psychology, and observations of individual psychology could result in a science of society or sociology. It should be noted that much subsequent theoretical work in mathematics and social science did not find Mill's ideas useful.
What were Auguste Comte's sociological ideas?
Comte believed that in all the sciences, there are three historical phases: theological, metaphysical, and scientific or positive. The theological phase contains religious restrictions and belief in the supernatural. The metaphysical phase involves the justification of political rights above authority. In the scientific phase, solutions to social problems can be found. By combining these laws of phases, Comte developed an encyclopedic law, according to which all of the sciences could be ordered into a hierarchy in which sociology was the greatest and included all of the others. Comte wrote, "If it is true that every theory must be based upon observed facts, it is equally true that facts cannot be observed without the guidance of some theories." He thus posited an interconnection between facts and theories, which holds to this day.
What were Auguste Comte's sociological ideas?
Comte believed that in all the sciences, there are three historical phases: theological, metaphysical, and scientific or positive. The theological phase contains religious restrictions and belief in the supernatural. The metaphysical phase involves the justification of political rights above authority. In the scientific phase, solutions to social problems can be found. By combining these laws of phases, Comte developed an encyclopedic law, according to which all of the sciences could be ordered into a hierarchy in which sociology was the greatest and included all of the others. Comte wrote, "If it is true that every theory must be based upon observed facts, it is equally true that facts cannot be observed without the guidance of some theories." He thus posited an interconnection between facts and theories, which holds to this day.
Did Auguste Comte believe in altruism?
Yes. In fact, Comte coined the word altruism, meaning an obligation to help and serve others, even at cost or harm to one's own self-interests.
Did Auguste Comte believe in altruism?
Yes. In fact, Comte coined the word altruism, meaning an obligation to help and serve others, even at cost or harm to one's own self-interests.
What was 19th century intuitionism?
To some extent, all philosophical systems have a place for intuition. Direct knowledge that is non-inferential or cannot be proved by prior argument and for which there is no way to resolve doubts. Mill thought that William Whewell's 1794–1866 philosophy of science was intuitive, although it was in places quite inferential. However, Whewell did have an explicitly intuitionist moral theory. Other noteworthy 19th-century intuitionists were William Hamilton, F. H. Bradley, Henry Sidgwick, James Martineau, and, toward the end of the century and into the next, Henry Bergson.
What was 19th century intuitionism?
To some extent, all philosophical systems have a place for intuition. Direct knowledge that is non-inferential or cannot be proved by prior argument and for which there is no way to resolve doubts. Mill thought that William Whewell's 1794–1866 philosophy of science was intuitive, although it was in places quite inferential. However, Whewell did have an explicitly intuitionist moral theory. Other noteworthy 19th-century intuitionists were William Hamilton, F. H. Bradley, Henry Sidgwick, James Martineau, and, toward the end of the century and into the next, Henry Bergson.
What was William Whewell's intuitionist moral philosophy?
Whewell, 1794–1866, claimed that conscience enables direct perception of moral goodness and badness. However, he did not describe conscience as a separate moral faculty but as reason exercised on moral subjects. Moral rules are primary principles of reason, discoverable by reason itself. He took them to be self-evident necessary truths.
What was William Whewell's intuitionist moral philosophy?
Whewell, 1794–1866, claimed that conscience enables direct perception of moral goodness and badness. However, he did not describe conscience as a separate moral faculty but as reason exercised on moral subjects. Moral rules are primary principles of reason, discoverable by reason itself. He took them to be self-evident necessary truths.
What was Scottish common sense philosophy?
It was the realist view of human knowledge put forth by Thomas Reid. 1710 to 1796, that what we know are real objects in the world and not our ideas, as claimed by David Hume, 1711 to 1776.
What was Scottish common sense philosophy?
It was the realist view of human knowledge put forth by Thomas Reid. 1710 to 1796, that what we know are real objects in the world and not our ideas, as claimed by David Hume, 1711 to 1776.
Who was William Hamilton?
William Hamilton, 1788 to 1856, was a professor at Scotland's University of Edinburgh. He is famous for his philosophy of the conditioned in Scottish common sense philosophy. He agreed with Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, that we cannot know things in themselves. But also with Thomas Reid, 1710 to 1796, about naturalism. Reid's idea that we know things in the world directly and Kant's idea that we do not know things in themselves are contradictory. Hamilton believed that they could be mysteriously combined through intuition. John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873, in an examination of Sir William Hamilton's philosophy, 1865. Vigorously attacked Hamilton's notion that scientific principles are intuitively valid, rather than valid on account of their ability to provide causal explanations, as Mill thought.
Who was William Hamilton?
William Hamilton, 1788 to 1856, was a professor at Scotland's University of Edinburgh. He is famous for his philosophy of the conditioned in Scottish common sense philosophy. He agreed with Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, that we cannot know things in themselves. But also with Thomas Reid, 1710 to 1796, about naturalism. Reid's idea that we know things in the world directly and Kant's idea that we do not know things in themselves are contradictory. Hamilton believed that they could be mysteriously combined through intuition. John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873, in an examination of Sir William Hamilton's philosophy, 1865. Vigorously attacked Hamilton's notion that scientific principles are intuitively valid, rather than valid on account of their ability to provide causal explanations, as Mill thought.
What was William Hamilton's philosophy of the conditioned?
Hamilton called the conditioned something that has been described or classified, and the unconditioned things that are without descriptions or classifications. His philosophy was an attempt to create a balance between the conditioned and the unconditioned. Hamilton wrote that all that is conceivable in thought lies between two extremes, which, as contradictory of each other, cannot both be true, but of which, as mutually contradictory, one must be true. The law of the mind. That the conceivable is in every relation bounded by the inconceivable, I call the law of the conditioned. Hamilton held the theological belief that the infinite is incognizable and inconceivable.
What was William Hamilton's philosophy of the conditioned?
Hamilton called the conditioned something that has been described or classified, and the unconditioned things that are without descriptions or classifications. His philosophy was an attempt to create a balance between the conditioned and the unconditioned. Hamilton wrote that all that is conceivable in thought lies between two extremes, which, as contradictory of each other, cannot both be true, but of which, as mutually contradictory, one must be true. The law of the mind. That the conceivable is in every relation bounded by the inconceivable, I call the law of the conditioned. Hamilton held the theological belief that the infinite is incognizable and inconceivable.
How did John Stuart Mill criticize William Whewell's view of moral intuitionism?
Mill's criticism of Whewell's moral intuitionism was that it implied that morality could not progress because necessary truths are always true. Mill further claimed that Whewell's necessary moral truths would preserve the status quo, and he charged Whewell with conservatively supporting slavery, marriage without women's consent, and cruelty to animals. What Mill missed, however, was that, as with fundamental ideas in science, Whewell held that we may not know all of the relevant rules of morality. Thus, discovering these rules allowed for moral progress.
How did John Stuart Mill criticize William Whewell's view of moral intuitionism?
Mill's criticism of Whewell's moral intuitionism was that it implied that morality could not progress because necessary truths are always true. Mill further claimed that Whewell's necessary moral truths would preserve the status quo, and he charged Whewell with conservatively supporting slavery, marriage without women's consent, and cruelty to animals. What Mill missed, however, was that, as with fundamental ideas in science, Whewell held that we may not know all of the relevant rules of morality. Thus, discovering these rules allowed for moral progress.
Who was F. H. Bradley?
Francis Herbert, F. H. Bradley, 1846–1924, was a main architect of 19th-century British idealism. But he was also highly influential as an intuitionist. His principal work was Ethical Studies, 1876, in which he sought to explain how morality can be part of individual consciousness and social institutions. He argued that individuals believe that morality is an intrinsic value, which, depending on their social status, they self-realize in their actions. Good selves could be actualized only if bad selves were suppressed. Therefore, the good self requires the bad self, and morality can never be completely actualized unless oneself dies through surrender to Christianity.
Who was F. H. Bradley?
Francis Herbert, F. H. Bradley, 1846–1924, was a main architect of 19th-century British idealism. But he was also highly influential as an intuitionist. His principal work was Ethical Studies, 1876, in which he sought to explain how morality can be part of individual consciousness and social institutions. He argued that individuals believe that morality is an intrinsic value, which, depending on their social status, they self-realize in their actions. Good selves could be actualized only if bad selves were suppressed. Therefore, the good self requires the bad self, and morality can never be completely actualized unless oneself dies through surrender to Christianity.
Was F. H. Bradley also an idealist?
It's not clear whether Bradley was an idealist, though he did believe that our direct experience of particular existence is what we can call reality. In his second major work, The Principles of Logic, 1883, Bradley attempted to construct the metaphysical system that would explain his ethics. Thought is embodied in judgments, which must be true or false. Ideas are the contents of judgments, and they represent reality. Ideas also represent kinds of things, each member of which is a particular individual, in the sense of an object. For example, you can have the idea of your particular pet dog, Rover. And that idea represents just Rover, but you also have the idea of dogs that represents all dogs. However, all judgments are hypotheticals claiming that certain universal connections exist in reality. For example, if one makes the judgment that dogs are good companions for humans, one is claiming that dogs in a general sense that applies to all. Dogs are good companions in a general sense that applies to all human beings. But such a judgment is hypothetical because you might have a dog that is not a good companion for you. Reality is the sum total of everything that there is in the world, and as such, reality is what Bradley called a concrete whole. One encounters reality by the experiences that one has. That is, judgments are abstract, whereas reality is particular. For this reason, thought can never fully represent reality. Another way of putting this is that the real world cannot be completely described and classified by us. Finally, in his Appearance and Reality, 1893, Bradley further explained that reality, as experience, is all blended in harmony. Bradley thought that relations such as bigger, smaller, before, and after are appearances, not reality. Relations are abstracted by thought from direct experience of reality. This direct experience taken altogether is the absolute, and, in a surprising turn, Bradley concluded that the absolute, or the totality of our experience, is the real reality, as opposed to something that our experience could be experience of. In other words, Bradley held both that our experiences are experiences of reality and that all of our experiences added up constitute reality.
Was F. H. Bradley also an idealist?
It's not clear whether Bradley was an idealist, though he did believe that our direct experience of particular existence is what we can call reality. In his second major work, The Principles of Logic, 1883, Bradley attempted to construct the metaphysical system that would explain his ethics. Thought is embodied in judgments, which must be true or false. Ideas are the contents of judgments and they represent reality. Ideas also represent kinds of things, each member of which is a particular individual, in the sense of an object. For example, you can have the idea of your particular pet dog, Rover. And that idea represents just Rover, but you also have the idea of dogs that represents all dogs. However, all judgments are hypotheticals claiming that certain universal connections exist in reality. For example, if one makes the judgment that dogs are good companions for humans, one is claiming that dogs in a general sense that applies to all. Dogs are good companions in a general sense that applies to all human beings. But such a judgment is hypothetical because you might have a dog that is not a good companion for you. Reality is the sum total of everything that there is in the world, and as such, reality is what Bradley called a concrete whole. One encounters reality by the experiences that one has. That is, judgments are abstract, whereas reality is particular. For this reason, thought can never fully represent reality. Another way of putting this is that the real world cannot be completely described and classified by us. Finally, in his Appearance and Reality, 1893, Bradley further explained that reality, as experience, is all blended in harmony. Bradley thought that relations such as bigger, smaller, before, and after are appearances, not reality. Relations are abstracted by thought from direct experience of reality. This direct experience taken altogether is the absolute, and, in a surprising turn, Bradley concluded that the absolute, or the totality of our experience, is the real reality, as opposed to something that our experience could be experience of. In other words, Bradley held both that our experiences are experiences of reality and that all of our experiences added up constitute reality.